Good morning, everyone. Good morning. See all that energy in the room. That's excellent. As could be said for many lawyers, our speaker this morning, Michael, found the practice of law somewhat, shall we say, stifling. And that is what led him to a writing career. The court martial of Paul Revere, Peaches and Daddy, and the Mad Bomber of New York are products of his love for narrative history combined with some 30 years in the trenches as an attorney. He's a graduate of Pepperdine University School of Law and was a member and editor of the Pepperdine Law Review. He's been engaged in private law practice since 1984 and is licensed before the Massachusetts Bar, the Federal District Court for the District of Massachusetts, and the United States Supreme Court. He lives in suburban Boston. Speaking to you this morning on his book, The Great Miscalculation, The Race to Save New York City, Citicorp Tower. Please give a warm Brotherhood welcome to Michael Greenburg.
Thank you for that warm introduction. I appreciate it. It's good to see you all this morning. In the quiet of his Sebago Lake summer retreat, William LeMessurier soberly contemplates suicide. The celebrated structural engineer has performed a meticulous floor-by-floor, brace-by-brace analysis of the Manhattan skyscraper that bears his signature design, a design that he now believes is gravely flawed. His focus centers on the 30th floor, where he suspects the bracing joints are most vulnerable to extreme winds. If those joints fail, so too will the rest of the tower. He nervously calculates the probability of a storm in New York strong enough to cause the bolts holding the 30th floor joints to stress to point of fracture. Through careful examination of weather records, he determines, to his dismay, that a 16-year storm could cause a catastrophic failure, a 1 in 16 chance. Staring blankly out the window of his island home and grimly aware that the Atlantic hurricane season is fast approaching, LeMessurier considers the prospect of professional disgrace, financial ruin, and the horror of a building collapse in the heart of New York City. I again want to thank the Beth Brotherhood for inviting me this morning and for allowing me to share with you what I consider to be one of America's most fascinating and yet overlooked stories of the 20th century. It's a story of an iconic New York skyscraper, a hidden flaw, and a structural engineer who suddenly found himself facing a crisis that tested not only his career, but his very character. It's the story of ingenuity, ethics, and principles. This is actually, I think, it's my 4th visit to the Brotherhood breakfast, and so the next little vignette may sound familiar to you, so bear with me if there's some repetition here. The back flap of The Great Miscalculation states that this is my 5th book. Well, that isn't entirely true. I wrote my first book in 1966. I was 9. The name of the book was Mystery on Mars. It was a wonderful story filled with illustrations and chapters and a wild storyline, and I was tremendously proud of what I had accomplished. I remember looking through the Boston telephone books for publishers, and I recall picking up the phone and calling Little Brown because I liked the way the name sounded. The woman who answered the phone was very nice, and I told her about my masterpiece, and I asked her if she'd be willing to publish it. Well, she told me that if I could type it up and send the manuscript in, they would be happy to consider it. Well, convinced that I had just stamped my ticket to stardom, I ran to my mother and asked her to type up my book so I could submit it to Little Brown. Now, I love my mother dearly. She was a hard-working single parent at the time. She had a lot on her plate, so of course she said no. And I was devastated, and I had no idea how to type, So that was temporarily the end of my dream of authorship. Well, as the years went by, scarred as I was, I finished school, went to college, and did what most other scarred and individuals do. I went to law school, and it was there that my interest in writing was rekindled. So I suppose The Great Miscalculation is really the very long sequel to Mystery on Mars. It only took me 60 years to complete it. I first learned of William LeMessurier and the 1978 Citicorp engineering crisis, oddly enough, while exploring the life of Louis Zamperini, the subject of the book and motion picture Unbroken. Zamperini's story of courage and heroism inspired me and got me thinking about heroes in a different sense. Not all heroes make the front page, and some are flawed, unrecognized. Some simply do the right thing, quietly, without expecting applause. And then there are those rare individuals who admit a mistake, face the consequences, and still make a difference. With those parameters in place, I was only steps away from William LeMessurier. LeMessurier passed away in 2007, but in the course of researching the story, I spoke with his daughters who kindly shared their personal memories of their father, both the man and the engineer. I also talked with several of his surviving colleagues who generously shared their recollections of the engineering flaw along with the technical details about the building and its design. Well, in the summer of 1978, the New York newspapers engaged in a citywide strike, and thus the crisis was, to LeMessurier's immense relief, sparsely covered by the press. It was not until 1995 when a freelance writer named Joe Morgenstern stumbled on the story, personally met with LeMessurier, and published an article about the crisis in the New Yorker. Joe was kind enough to share all of his files with me, including interview transcripts, notes, everything, and they proved invaluable in the writing of the book. After his death, LeMessurier's family donated his papers to the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Those papers contain many of the surviving documents, memos, records, and correspondence dealing directly with his design of the Citicorp Tower and the events of 1978. Well, thanks to these archives and the transcripts provided by Joe Morgenstern, William LeMessurier essentially tells his own story. So any discussion of the Citicorp Tower necessarily begins, ironically enough, with an old and crumbling Gothic church at the corner of East 54th and Lexington. In the late 1960s, St. Peter's Lutheran Church was facing a difficult reality. Its congregation was shrinking, the building was falling apart, and many churches were just leaving the city. But St. Peter's had a shrewd, forward-thinking pastor, Ralph Peterson, who saw something different. He recognized the value of the church's land and the continuing need for a spiritual presence in Midtown Manhattan. When Peterson learned that a real estate firm was quietly assembling the city block for some mysterious project and client, he immediately realized that the church property, integral to the development, any development on the block, was about to skyrocket in value. Many urged him to sell and move on, but Peterson held firm. He wanted to keep St. Peter's in the city, right where it stood. Eventually, he discovered who the mystery client was, Citibank, by then known as Citicorp, and their plan for a massive high-rise development on the block. When approached by the bank's agents about purchasing the church property, Peterson bluntly informed them, "We aren't leaving." He insisted that any new development plans must accommodate the church in its present location, but he also recognized that his building was deteriorating. Negotiations were long and painstaking, taking years to complete. In the end, they reached a creative solution. The old Gothic church would be demolished and a new, architecturally distinct church would rise in its place. The church sold its land to Citicorp for $9 million. The bank then converted the block into a giant condominium and sold the corner back to the church as a separate unit. The New York Times wrote, "Since St. Peter's real estate club was equal to its moral claim, a little arm twisting might have been involved." The final arrangement was overwhelmingly approved by the voting members of the congregation. In keeping with Peterson's vision of an architecturally independent building, physically separate from the skyscraper, it was stipulated that the airspace above about 2/3 of the new church's footprint would remain open and that no element of the bank's tower would encroach upon or interfere with the church building below. It seemed like a reasonable stipulation, but that unambiguous and seemingly innocuous requirement would set into motion an engineering predicament with potentially catastrophic consequences. With the basic site constraints in place, work on the Citicorp Center design began. From the start, the architect chosen by the bank, Hugh Stubbins, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, wrestled with the required location of the church as it affected the design of the skyscraper. If the building's bottom columns were placed conventionally at the four corners, one column would literally pierce through the sanctuary of the new church, a total non-starter under the bank's agreement with Pastor Peterson. Knowing that the dilemma would require some skilled and creative engineering, Stubbins met with his friend and colleague, William LeMessurier, a structural engineer also of Cambridge, who he had worked with on many other design projects in the past. Over lunch one afternoon, the two men considered various design possibilities, but ultimately decided that a cantilever of one corner over the building, over the church, could resolve the problem. As they talked further, Stubbins suggested that if they could cantilever one corner, well, why not two, or three, or even all four? To make this work, they recognized that the bottom support columns of the skyscraper would have to be massive and multiple stories in height. And more importantly, they would have to be placed at the outside center of each wall rather than at the corners. It was a bold and audacious proposal. Well, to accomplish this, LeMessurier needed to develop a way to channel structural loads to the bottom columns. He began devising a rudimentary bracing system consisting of a series of structurally independent V-shaped chevrons, each multiple stories in height and intersected by mass columns vertically extending the full length of each side of the tower to the base. He famously drew the concept on a napkin as he lunched with Stubbins. Well, through this groundbreaking use of what he called super modules, he insisted that wind and gravity loads could be gathered in increments and guided down via diagonal compression through the base truss and distributed to the main columns below. Simply put, whatever would be lost by the center placement of the base columns would be gained by this unique system of bracing support. This is a very efficient cantilever, he later wrote. It's a mathematical ideal. To this innovative and lightweight design, LeMessurier incorporated a first of its kind tuned mass damper at the top of the tower, a 29 square foot, 8 foot thick, 400-ton yellow block of concrete set on a thin bed of oil designed to shift in opposition to the sway of the building. Importantly, the damper was intended only for the comfort of the building occupants and not for the structural safety of the tower. So with this complex engineering system agreed to, designed, and tested, construction of the tower began and progressed without incident. Upon its completion, the Citicorp Center was met with almost universal praise by the critics. On October 12, 1977, at the dedication of the Citicorp Center with Governor Hugh Carey and Mayor Abraham Beame in attendance, Hugh Stubbins, in his remarks, called his creation a skyscraper for the people. The Citicorp Tower was, perhaps, Lemessurier's crowning achievement and became a catalyst for his career. His novel wind-bracing system and innovative application of damping technology earned him international acclaim, and in February of 1978, he was inducted into the National Academy of Engineering, one of the highest honors bestowed in his profession. In the fall of 1977, just a few months after dedication of the Citicorp Tower, a Princeton undergraduate engineering student named Diane Hartley began work on her senior thesis. Under the guidance of her supervisor, Professor David Billington, Hartley undertook a detailed study of the scientific, social, and symbolic aspects of the new Citicorp Tower in New York City. It was an ambitious project, and one that would take her on a ponderous journey. The final thesis included a detailed history, not only of Citicorp Center, but of skyscrapers as an American institution. It encompassed 460 pages with 440 endnotes, 96 detailed plates, and 29 mostly hand-drawn technical figures in 2 leather-bound volumes. It was an extraordinary document. As part of her work, Diane Hartley had reached out to Lemessurier's office in Cambridge, who directed her immediately to their engineering team in New York City, who was responsible for the original implementation of Lemessurier's design. This was in a day when nefarious motives such as terrorism and sabotage weren't quite yet immediately suspected. And so Lemessurier's New York engineers spoke openly with Hartley about the engineering of the tower, even sharing with her copies of their plans and calculations upon which the construction was based. Well, by mid-March, with the deadline for her thesis already extended, Hartley turned to the final critical phase of her analysis, testing the wind resistance of the Citicorp Tower. Her approach was methodical. She broke down the expected design stresses of the building and compared them to the actual calculations provided by Lemessurier's team. She began with the basics: the weight of the tower, its density, and its ability to withstand pressures at different heights. When she compared her calculations to the design stresses, her numbers aligned very closely with those of the New York engineers. But there was one key assumption in those calculations. They only accounted for wind striking the tower straight on at a perpendicular angle. Well, at the time, New York City's building code did not explicitly require engineers to consider non-perpendicular winds in high-rise construction. Perhaps that was because lighter, more complex skyscrapers were still a rather new phenomenon in the 1970s. Even Lemessurier himself later wrote that wind from diagonal angles just wasn't widely discussed in engineering literature or the classroom. But even as an undergraduate, Diane Hartley intuited otherwise. In her thesis, she wrote, "The situation of a quartering wind must be examined in addition to that of wind striking full face." So what exactly is a quartering wind? It is a wind that strikes the corner of a building at a 45-degree angle, thus impacting 2 sides at once rather than just one. Unlike a straight-on wind that presses against a single face, a quartering wind spreads its force across multiple surfaces, creating a very different and potentially more dangerous load on the structure. Hartley ran the numbers. Using basic geometry, she calculated that while the force on any single face of the building in a quartering wind was only about 71% of that from a straight-on wind, the total wind load actually doubled because two sides were affected. The result being that the building would experience 42% higher stresses in quartering winds than in perpendicular winds. Well, this was a critical finding. She pored over the structural drawings and calculations, expecting to see some confirmation that the engineers had accounted for this effect. But she found nothing. No analysis of quartering winds, no adjustments for their impact on the building's unique column structure. Instead, the official wind stress calculations showed numbers significantly lower than what she expected. Were these preliminary numbers, she asked? Had the real calculations been done later? She was down to the last 2 pages of her thesis and she needed answers. Desperate for clarity, she went back to Lemessurier's New York engineers. What am I doing wrong? She asked. Why don't my numbers match? She hesitated, even making the call. Lemessurier's office was world-renowned, respected across the field of engineering. The Citicorp tower was standing tall, praised, admired, an architectural marvel. And here she was, just a student, with no real experience, no credibility. Surely there had to be an explanation for the discrepancy. She explained that when it came to perpendicular winds, her numbers matched his perfectly. But when she factored in diagonal winds, the stresses shot up far beyond what was reflected in the construction plans. What concerned her most was the odd placement of the building's main columns and their potential vulnerability to quartering winds. Nervously, she asked Lemessurier's engineers if maybe she had overlooked something. Well, the engineer calmly explained that she had nothing to worry about. Far from being a weakness, he told her, the tower's column placement actually made it more resilient in quartering winds. He described how, in a conventional design where the columns are at the corners, only one column bears the brunt of a quartering wind, while another absorbs compression. The remaining two simply act as pivots. But Citicorp columns weren't at the corners. They were set in from the edges. That meant two legs were working in tension and two in compression, creating a more balanced, efficient system for resisting those diagonal forces. Yes, he acknowledged, quartering winds do increase the load, but because of the tower's unique design, that load was better distributed. It simply wasn't a critical factor in evaluating this building's structural integrity. Well, Hartley was a bit perplexed, but also very relieved. She just wanted to finish her thesis, graduate, and move on with her life. So she accepted the engineer's explanation without argument. Well, as it turned out, Diane Hartley was right to this degree. Quartering winds did create more variable stress levels on parts of the tower than perpendicular winds, but the placement and strength of the columns themselves was not the real problem. As designed, those columns could withstand winds from any direction. However, the Citicorp engineering team did fail to fully analyze the impact of quartering winds on every other structural component of the tower. Unbeknownst to Hartley, to Lemessurier, or to anyone else at the time, the building still harbored a hidden vulnerability to quartering winds, a subtle, overlooked feature that under the right conditions could cause wind forces to amplify in ways that nobody had predicted. Now, ironically, at about the same time that Hartley was placing the finishing touches on her thesis, another student telephoned Lemessurier's Cambridge office and asked to speak with the engineer. Now, Lemessurier was an educator, and though he was in the middle of a meeting at the time, he agreed to take the call. The student explained that he was a freshman architectural student in New Jersey, and that his professor had assigned him a paper on the Citicorp tower. The bottom columns, the student told Lemessurier, were, according to his professor, in the wrong place. Well, Lemessurier took great pleasure in describing the unique field conditions presented by St. Peter's Church that required the mid-face placement of the columns, and he explained that in a quartering wind, these columns actually performed even more efficiently than had they been placed at the corners. Tell your professor that, Lemessurier quoted. Only years later did the colleague, who was named Lee DeCarius, learn about the Citicorp engineering classes and conclude that he was the student who may have set into motion Lemessurier's later discovery. Now, did Lemessurier's New York engineers communicate Diane Hartley's concerns to him? We simply do not know. Hartley never claimed to have spoken directly to Lemessurier, but she did correctly identify the general problem of quartering winds in the design of the Citicorp tower. The Carolus had never even heard of quartering winds, but it is reasonable to conclude that both Hartley and the Carolus contributed in some way to what would happen next. In the coming days, Lemessurier decided that the placement of the Citicorp tower columns and the design of his unique chevron bracing system would make a wonderful lecture topic for his engineering class at Harvard, and he began making some notes and calculations about the topic. As Lemessurier began preparing his lecture notes, something nagged at him. A month earlier, while consulting on the plans for 2 other skyscrapers in Pittsburgh, he had learned that the member joints for the chevron bracing system at the Citicorp tower had been secured with high-capacity bolts rather than the stronger but more expensive welding process originally called for by the plans, a change that his firm approved. By itself, this was not an unusual or concerning modification. It was a more cost-efficient option, and if properly engineered, completely appropriate. Well, as Lemessurier dug deeper into his calculations, however, he discovered what he later called some very peculiar behavior in his wind bracing system. He learned that inherent in the design of the chevrons, the stresses in 4 of the 8 bracing members in each module vanished to 0 in a quartering wind, but at the same time, they increased by 40% in the remaining 4. When the wind blew directly against the structure in a perpendicular direction, these diagonal braces remained compressed due to the combination of gravity and wind tension. But when the wind blew at an angle, certain of those braces partially unloaded from their compressed state in such a way that amplified the tension on them. Lemessurier knew that if the overall chevron bracing system was reactive to quartering winds, then so too must be the splices that held that system together. He also knew that had the original specifications not been changed from full penetration welds for these splices, the bracing system would have provided more than ample resistance to winds from any direction. But with that change, the strength and the capacity of the bolts that secured the connection instantly became a matter of unease, because he was certain that his engineers had not considered quartering winds in the design of those bolts. He insisted that New York code only required consideration of perpendicular winds, and that analysis of diagonal winds was simply not part of the custom and practice of high-rise building design at the time. Well, though not yet in a panic, Lemessurier immediately went down to his New York office and reviewed all the shop drawings and calculations for his Citicorp bracing system. He quickly confirmed that indeed quartering winds were not taken into consideration in the engineering of the wind bracing systems places. But he also learned to his dismay that instead of deducting only 75% of the actual gravity load in the building to offset wind tension, as was required as a conservative factor of safety, his team had deducted the full compression amount, 100%. In so doing, the engineers concluded that only 4 bolts per splice were required. Now, if the effect of a quartering wind was considered, the wind stresses increased, as we learned, by 40%. That being the case, the measure calculated instead of 4 bolts, more than 10 bolts would have been required per slice. And had his team properly deducted only 75% of the gravity load to offset quartering wind tension rather than 100%, 14 bolts per splice would have been needed. This thing is in real trouble, he began to think. At that point, LeMessurier traveled to Ontario, Canada, to meet with his wind tunnel experts to obtain up-to-date weather statistics and to reanalyze the Citicorp tower based on the effect of quartering winds on the bolted bracing system. He took the raw data back to his island home in Maine and spent the weekend immersed in calculations and probabilities. To his dismay, he now concluded that his building could in fact collapse in a storm that could strike New York City once every 16 years. The reality of a cataclysmic structural failure began to possess him. Well, LeMessurier was now faced with an impossible decision. Remain silent and pray that the building could withstand a destructive storm, or endure the risk of professional disgrace, humiliation, and the legal consequences of disclosure. Both seemed unthinkable, and each forced him into a corner. Suicide actually did cross his mind. To be sure, that would have ended his present anxiety, but he had a family and a legacy that weighed on his mind. By the end of the weekend, his thoughts cleared, and his only viable choice emerged. He would disclose his findings and face whatever consequences befell him. I had information that nobody else in the world had, he later wrote. I had power in my hands to effect extraordinary events that only I could initiate. Well, unable to reach his architect, Hugh Stubbins, who was in California at the time, LeMessurier first connected with Stubbins' lawyer and arranged a meeting. On the lawyer's advice, LeMessurier quickly notified his insurance company of the potential claim, and within 24 hours he was in a New York conference room surrounded by insurance defense lawyers. The Citicorp tower was observably sound and of worldwide architectural acclaim. They thought I was nutty, he called LeMessurier. Nobody in his right mind calls up and says, my building is going to fall down. He nervously told the gathering, it doesn't take more than 10 minutes to realize that this is a disaster. He admitted that his office had failed to consider non-perpendicular winds in the design of the splicing bolts. The impact of quartering winds, he claimed, would not have been of any consequence had the original design of welded connections and the diagonal bracing system been adhered to. Once those connections were converted to bolts, however, a change he insisted he was unaware of at the time, it fell upon his engineers to accurately design the capacity and strength of those bolts. He then admitted that his office had failed to consider non-perpendicular winds in that design. The result, he told them, was a series of vastly overstressed bracing connections in the building. LeMessurier had prepared a streamlined summary of his calculations, and he circulated it among the lawyers. The Citicorp tower, he told them, was in great danger. He reminded the men that hurricane season was fast approaching. To independently verify LeMessurier's concerns, the insurance company had called in an independent structural engineer by the name of Leslie Robertson, famed for his design of the Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center. Robertson immediately confirmed to the group that given the findings presented, they were in all probability facing the imminent prospect of total collapse of the tower in severe winds. The next step, of course, was to notify the bank that its $193 million investment was in immediate and grave danger. LeMessurier and Stubbins escalated the alarming news up the corporate ladder. They met with bank officers who listened carefully and had passed it along to the chairman. By day's end, the two men found themselves in front of one of the most powerful figures in American finance. Walter Wriston, the formidable chairman of Citicorp, was no ordinary banker. Widely regarded as the most influential financier of his era, he had the air of presidency and the clout to move markets. Surprisingly, Wriston accepted the news calmly and began thinking about the public relations aspect of what would happen next. His mind was already formulating a press release that would not only advise the public, but also preserve the indelible reputation of the bank. LeMessurier had already developed a solution to the problem in his mind. A series of carefully engineered steel plates could be welded to both sides of each bolted connection like a splint to secure and reinforce the joints. He had created a detailed risk analysis of the tower and generated a priority schematic of sorts for the order of repairs to be conducted, with the sober understanding that if one of the bolted connections failed, so too would the others, with a calamitous result. In the following weeks, LeMessurier shuttled back and forth to New York, held endless meetings with engineers, steel fabricators, lawyers, and bank officers, even setting up a war room of sorts in Frank Sinatra's Waldorf Astoria suite while Sinatra was on tour. Robertson insisted that local and state authorities be notified of the problem and the remedial work that was to occur, and meetings with those officials also took place as required. A specialized firm from California was called in to wire the building with sensors to provide an advanced warning system in the case of untoward movement or instability. They had the tuned-mass damper fine-tuned well beyond its intended specifications to accommodate as much as possible dangerous building sway, and they added an emergency backup generator to be activated in the event of power loss. Weather forecasters were hired to provide hourly tracking of adverse weather events along the East Coast, and the engineers were given personal beepers to alert them of any untoward movement of the tower. By all accounts, the engineers, technicians, bank officers, and bureaucrats worked side by side in a resolute and single-minded spirit of cooperation. Well, to LeMessurier's chagrin, however, an emergency evacuation plan was developed by the bank with Les Robertson's assistance to be implemented by the Red Cross and local authorities that would, if activated, displace thousands of occupants, patrons, and neighbors from the area and provide aid and shelter as required. It was the step that LeMessurier feared would end his career. It was agreed that the remedial work was to be conducted during the evening hours in order to minimize any disruption to the tenants in the building. Total secrecy was obviously impossible, but everyone involved did their best to downplay what was clearly a dangerous situation. A guarded and carefully calibrated public statement created and approved by Walter Wriston and the engineering team claimed that the purpose of the work was to strengthen the building as a matter of prudence in light of some new weather data, rather than necessity. The objective was to reinforce the building as secretly as possible without panic or concern about the safety of the structure. LeMessurier later admitted, "We had to cook up a line of bull, and white lies at this point are entirely moral." Well, the Citicorp press release seemed only to heighten media curiosity rather than allay it. One evening, LeMessurier returned to his hotel room and was informed that a reporter from the New York Times had called. Well, filled with dread, he vacillated on what to do. Just after 6 p.m., he picked up the phone and dialed the reporter's number at the Times. The call was answered by a recording stating that the New York Times had just gone out on strike. In point of fact, and to Lemaisure's enormous relief, every major newspaper in New York had joined the pressmen's strike. It would last through October. Lemaisure later said, "If the newspapers hadn't been on strike, I dread to think what would have happened. It would have been pure hell." It was, he said, the greatest thing that ever happened. The work to save the Citicorp Tower continued through the entire summer of 1978, in the dead of night, in the absence of the watchful eyes of the New York press. With each corrective weld, the building was strengthened, and as the summer progressed, the measure began to breathe somewhat easier, and then the weather changed. As the team pushed through the final days of August, another force was gathering deep in the central North Atlantic. On August 28th, satellite imagery showed a cyclonic churning of low cloud elements about 490 nautical miles southeast of Bermuda. 36 hours later, it was a tropical depression, and it was headed west-northwest. When word of the storm reached the engineers, the team ramped up into full disaster readiness. Labor Day weekend was approaching and the city was humming. By 6:30 a.m. on August 30th, the engineering team had already assembled at the Waldorf Command Center. They were deep into evaluating possible evacuation scenarios. Welding work was still underway. As Lemaisure admitted, we weren't quite ready. That evening, the storm was given a name, Tropical Storm Ella, the fifth named storm of the 1978 hurricane season. By 9 p.m., the National Weather Service issued a warning in all caps. Satellite pictures indicate Ella is continuing to strengthen and could be a hurricane within 24 hours. They weren't wrong. Flight reconnaissance confirmed it. Ship reports echoed it. By the night of August 31st, Ella had become a hurricane, heading toward the coast of North Carolina. The measure wasn't waiting to see if it would turn north toward New York. That possibility was obvious and terrifying. His jaw was throbbing. He was suffering with an impacted molar, aggravated by the ongoing stress. But the meetings had to go on. He sat with his team and with executives from the bank evaluated the building's readiness. The question on everyone's mind, could the tower survive a direct hit from Ella? If the tuned mass damper performed as it was enhanced, and the measure believed it could, the tower could withstand a 200-year storm at that moment. What kept him awake was a storm entering through the Narrows, its eye just west of Manhattan, hurling southeast winds directly at the tower. Ella, he feared, could be that storm. By Friday afternoon, September 1st, the storm was packing winds over 125 miles per hour, and the barometric pressure had dropped 959 millibars. Robertson's private meteorologists updated the engineers nearly every hour. As Ella roared out toward the Outer Banks, it began to track northward, up the East Coast, and toward New York. Everyone was sweating blood, Lemaisure later said. But then, on Saturday, September 2nd, a ridge of high pressure settled over the northeast, swiftly veering Ella north and away from the coast. It would go on to slam the Canadian Maritimes with winds of 140 miles per hour, the strongest storm to ever hit those waters. Well, by the end of the summer, work on the tower was complete. The measure insisted that it could now withstand a 1 in 1,000 year storm, as strong and impervious as any high-rise building in the world. As Joe Morgenstern wrote in his 1995 New Yorker piece about the Citicorp drama, the crisis produced heroes, but no villains. William Lemaisure's actions are remembered not only for his innovative and cerebral approaches under unspeakable stress, but also as a refreshing example of professional ethics and integrity in the engineering industry and beyond. He did have his detractors. After all, he had failed to properly oversee the engineering details of the building during its initial design, leaving all of that to his New York team, and he had engaged in a conspiracy of secrecy as to the real reasons for the corrective work. Wouldn't you have wanted to know the truth before you entered that building in 1978? Nevertheless, Lemessurier is almost universally revered for confronting the crisis at great risk to himself. As one commentator wrote, it may be Lemesurier's destiny to be known for the error he confessed, rather than for the skyscrapers he designed. At no time in his professional career has Lemessurier ever been better respected. Today, 601 Lexington stands as a silent testament to an engineer's courage and a lesson to all of us about the power of integrity. While we live in a world built on invisible trust, bridges, buildings, planes, this story reminds us how fragile that trust can be. Thank you very much.
Fascinating story, Attorney. Do you think in this age, supercomputing and AI, that this could have been identified, what's the side on that, been identified earlier than letting it go to that stage?
Yeah, there's no doubt that modern technology would have assisted, but if you talk to many structural engineers, a lot of them still prefer, especially the older ones, but they prefer to do a lot of these calculations by hand. And this was sort of like a confluence of tragic events that came together to create this that could never have been anticipated. Lemessurier never would have known about the flaw unless he started to do this analysis prompted by the students' calls. So, I mean, it's tough to say whether, I end the book with a statement that basically says, what other buildings are out there hiding their own flaws right now that we just don't know?
Well, we've all read the articles of that new building in New York on the waterfront that is going. So I guess even in this day and age.
Michael, do you want to take 10 seconds and promote the book that's right in front of you there?
Available now. Yeah, I didn't bring any, but you're welcome to purchase the book either from the publisher, New York University Press, or you can go to Amazon, or you can listen to it on, what do they call it, Audible. I'm local, and if anybody purchases the book and would like me to sign it, just let me know. Look me up. I'm online through my office, and happy to meet you, happy to sign it. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Whatever became of the young undergraduate female students, Hartley, whose 2-volume undergraduate thesis started this?
First of all, I have to, and I'm very grateful to her because, she gets, this story is not an unknown story, and, there have been TV spots on it, and so she's been interviewed a lot. But when I told her I was writing a book about it, at first she was a little bit tentative, and then she just opened up, and she was wonderful. She is very helpful because I'm not an engineer, and I know nothing about structural engineering. So she and others walked me through a lot of this. She was a structural engineer for a short time in her career. Then she went into commercial real estate, and now I believe she works for the government, the federal government. I think in building locations, things of that nature. Not at all, she's great.
Thank you for coming in. Who ended up paying for all the repairs? The insurance?
Yeah. Yeah, so I didn't have time to go into that aftermath, but there was definitely an aftermath. Fortunately, they were able to avoid any type of prolonged litigation. That's not to say that lawyers weren't involved, they were. But LeMessurier insisted that he be allowed to negotiate this settlement. He thought he was the best advocate. So the bank, went through, there was some posturing, made a claim. Turned out they settled for the full insurance proceeds, $4 million.
Oh, so it wasn't even that expensive to do the repair?
1978.
No, but even so, every mindset of.
But all it was steel plates.
Yeah.
I have a question just in regard to whether this spawned any subsequent actions, from regulators or anyone else to reevaluate other building designs.
So it's a very good question, because what caused a lot of this was the ambiguity in the New York Building Code. It said winds from all directions must be considered. Well, the way that was construed by engineers at the time was this way, but not that way. So it took a while. About 10 years later, they amended the code, and now the practice is more in fitting with what you would think. Interestingly, at the time that LeMessurier got the call, he was working on the design of the Back Bay Hilton, which is a triangular building. And so the idea of quartering winds was paramount in his mind. And so that's one of the other reasons why he became more immersed in these concerns of not having considered, the diagonal winds in this building.
Thank you, Tom. Actually, quite interesting. It's not something I was even aware of. Following up on the gentleman's question, I guess I'd be more interested in knowing if there were studies done on other buildings to determine whether or not they had a weakness of some sort of that nature, or even otherwise that could be caused by the quartering winds.
This building was unique in many ways. Most importantly, it was because of the structural system, the Chevron's structural system. It was extremely lightweight, and so that's why they had to compensate for that with the tune mass damper. So I don't know at the time if there were other buildings and that had the same problem. I am not aware, but I know that routinely, and it's almost like, I don't know if there's something like the National Safety Board that reviews bridge safety, but there's always the worry of deterioration, like the Surfside collapse in Florida, where it really kind of felt that it was just structurally unsound, that the metal supports were just corroding. So what it says to building owners and engineers is routine maintenance and inspection is absolutely critical, because there are also, even with bridges, there are many situations that are unpredictable. You couldn't see the deterioration. So I think new innovations and new materials are preventing that, but you're never going to eliminate it. And a lot of the buildings are old, so inspection becomes the important part.
With all of your research, was there a contingent of naysayers who said, no problem, you're wasting your time, wasting your money?
Excellent question. Not quite. What there was was a contingent who wouldn't speak at all. After 40 years, the feelings were still raw about what happened. And the firm itself still exists. LeMessurier and Associates still exists. They wouldn't return a call, an email. They wanted nothing to do with me. And then other engineers spoke to me anonymously. People were, I'm not going to say frightened, but they wanted to distance themselves from it. And I asked, well, why? Is that a happy ending? Everything worked out fine? Feelings were very wrong because of the potential for, effect on business, character, worry. They don't want to be, in other words, LeMessurier's firm doesn't want to be associated with a building firm. And if you go on their website, that building is there, and they talk about the wonderful design of the Citicorp Tower. They don't mention anything about a crisis in 1978. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Michael.